Hey guys, welcome to my practical guide for web development in 2018 in terms of technology and career. I did a 2017 version that was extremely popular, and there's been some changes in technology and software as well as my own opinions as I've grown as a developer. So I think it's a good idea to do one of these every year. And if you didn't see the 2017 version, don't worry about it. We're going to talk about everything we did in that video and more. It might even confuse you a little if you watch both. So in this video, we're going to focus on the here and now. Alright, so before we start, I just want to mention a few things. First of all, this is a guide for web development technologies and the options that you have. In no way do you need to learn everything that I mention here. In fact, that may be impossible. You'll notice that on a lot of the slides it says to choose one and stick with that. Also, this guide is based on fact and opinion. I tried as hard as possible to be unbiased. I don't have much bias with programming because I do understand that everyone's different and every project is different and not all needs are the same, but I will make subtle suggestions along the way. You should also look at other places for guidance, not just this video. This is not the end-all be-all to web development and what you should do. Look on YouTube, read articles, talk to colleagues, all that stuff. Now, this is very important, especially when it comes down to, how to follow this guide. It depends on what type of developer you want to be. Do you want to be a full stack developer, which works on the front end, back end? Do you want to specialize in the front end and in the UI, the user interface? Do you want to be a simple web designer that builds just basic brochure websites? Do you want to be a back-end engineer that creates complex APIs and manages databases? You'll need to make different choices depending on what kind of developer you want to be. But this guide in general is for full-stack web developers. Okay, but that doesn't mean that if you want to be a front-end developer, this is no use to you, because we're going to talk about that stuff as well. Alright, so let's take a look at some tools and software. Now, you're not going to need all of these at once when you first start. You're really only going to need the first two. The first being a text editor, or possibly an IDE, which is an integrated development environment. But an IDE is kind of overkill for most web development, so you'll probably want a text editor. And the three that I would suggest looking at is Visual Studio Code, Atom, and Sublime Text. These are all very customizable, they're very fast, they have tons of features, so I would suggest looking at these three, but there are others that you can look at as well. I'd also suggest a good browser. The browser that I would definitely suggest is Chrome, but Firefox is also a good browser. I would suggest Chrome because it's fast, it has the best dev tools, it uses the V8 JavaScript engine, which is the same engine that Node.js uses. It's just a great browser. Alright, Firefox coming in second, and anything other than that I would not recommend for web development. Now, image editing isn't as important as it used to be because we have so many tools now. We have UI frameworks that allow us to create things in the browser really quickly rather than creating full mock-ups in Photoshop like I used to do back 6-7 years ago when I had my own company. I would do that for clients, and it took a long time. Now, if you're a web designer and you're building like really beautiful artistic websites, then that's a different story. You're probably going to want to create mock-ups then. But if you're going to be an app developer, you're going to build full stack applications, you're probably just going to want a clean UI UX experience, and you'll probably end up using some kind of framework or just building a simple layout with Flexbox or the grid system or something like that. So deployment tools, this is definitely something you don't need right now if you're just starting out, but you will eventually need an FTP client to upload to your host, especially if you're using a shared host. An SSH tool, if you're on Windows, you'll probably work with PuTTY. If you're on Mac or Linux, you can simply use the SSH command. It's just a way to interact with your server and deploy applications. Now, cloud storage, this is something that is definitely optional, but something I'd recommend because I like to have my code available from everywhere, from all my computers. If I go on vacation, I want it on my laptop, and I want it all synced up. So I prefer Dropbox, but Google Drive, another good service. I'm sure there's others out there as well. All right, so now that we talked a little bit about tools and software, let's talk about the technologies that you need to learn. So HTML and CSS, I would say that you need to learn before anything else. If you're striving to be any kind of web developer that builds stuff in the browser, this is the most important thing to learn because HTML and CSS are the building blocks of the web. Every website that you visit uses HTML and CSS regardless of its back-end technologies. Regardless of the languages it uses on its server, the UI is always going to be in HTML and CSS. Even if it's generated by JavaScript or JSX, something like that, the end result is HTML and CSS. Now, the good news is it's very quick and easy to learn. It's not going to take a lot of your time. And one thing that I mentioned in the last video, the 2017 version, I said that you need to master both over time. And I've changed my outlook on that. You should master HTML5 semantics and layout, but CSS3 gives you a lot, especially when it comes to things like animation and transitions, and you definitely don't need to master that stuff, especially if you don't plan on using, building animated interfaces or anything like that. I would suggest learning Flexbox and the grid system. You don't have to master it at first, but learn to properly align your elements. Frameworks are great, but you should know how to align elements properly without using a framework. And then the last thing, responsiveness is crucial. Do not build layouts or websites or UIs that are not responsive, that don't look good on mobile devices. It used to be a luxury or kind of an added service for clients, but now at this time in 2017, 2018, it's a necessity and it's taken for granted. So you want to learn about CSS media queries, which are really not that hard. It's basically just saying, if the browser is, or if the device or the layout is at a certain width, then apply these styles, okay? So you want to stack elements on top of each other. If you have a row of 3 boxes, then you want to make sure when it's on a small screen, those boxes stack on top of each other. All right, so now that you know HTML and CSS and you're able to at least create a decent looking static website, it's time to start learning some real programming so that you can create at least somewhat of a dynamic user interface, and you can create events, you can play around with the DOM. And for this, you'll need to learn JavaScript. Now, there are some advanced topics in this slide, and if you don't plan on being a Node.js developer or using front-end frameworks like React and Angular, then not all of this is needed. For instance, if you're going to be a PHP or a Python developer and only build server-side applications where you render views on the server, you're not going to need to master JavaScript, but you should definitely know the basics and without using a framework. All right, and that goes for everybody, even JavaScript developers. You should definitely learn vanilla JavaScript before a framework, because nowadays people are actually going and learning React before they know how to write a for loop, which is just insane. You should not learn a framework before the language. Okay, so some of the things that you want to learn in terms of the basics are data types, functions, conditionals, loops, things like that. You're going to want to learn how to manipulate the DOM, learn about the document object model, events, things like that, and do this without jQuery. Okay, jQuery stopped a lot of people from learning actual JavaScript, and I'm not saying jQuery doesn't have its place anywhere, but you should learn the language before learning a library. So Ajax and the Fetch API are used to make HTTP requests, and they're used for asynchronous JavaScript and all that. This isn't so important to learn if you're not going to be a JavaScript developer per se. If you're going to focus on Python or Ruby or PHP, these things aren't so important. I would definitely suggest learning JSON though, because JSON is used all around in all languages and APIs. So JSON is very important. It's also very easy to learn. You can check out my JSON crash course if you want. I think it's 20 minutes long, and it teaches you all of the basics. So ES 2015 plus, meaning newer features of JavaScript. Again, if you're going to be a JavaScript developer, you're going to work with Node.js and React, then this is very important. If not, then I would suggest just learning the basics like template strings and let and const, things like that. So now that you know HTML, CSS, and some JavaScript, now you need to learn how to deploy a basic website. And I'm talking about just a static brochure type site, nothing extravagant with, really dynamic functionality. So you're going to need a shared hosting account. I would suggest InMotion. That's what I've used for years now. I have a shared hosting account with them. I have a VPS, a reseller account. HostGator is also another company that I've worked with a lot. You want to learn the basics of cPanel, which is the most popular hosting control panel. So just things like creating email accounts, creating FTP accounts. You're going to want to learn how to upload a site with FTP, the file transfer protocol. FileZilla is the most popular and the easiest client to use to do that. And it's FTP, by the way, is very slow, but it is very easy to use. So at this point, I would suggest FTP. Later on, you might want to learn how to SSH into your server and use SCP and all that stuff. But right now, FTP is the easiest choice. You also want to register a domain name and learn about DNS and name servers. If you have a domain name that is with a different company than your hosting account and you need to connect them, then you need to set up your name servers within the back end of your interface there, your domain registrar. So learn about all that stuff. Get a website up on the internet on a domain name, and you're now officially a web designer or a basic front-end web developer if you know all the stuff that we've talked about so far. So you should be able to create very simple websites and user interfaces. Maybe you can take a PSD, which is a Photoshop file, an image file, and create an HTML, CSS template or website from that. And that's actually something that people actually hire you for, is just to do that. You'll have a designer on your team that will create the design, and then you will take that design and make it into a working website. So you should be able to add at least a little bit of dynamic qualities to your user interface. So button clicks, maybe like a slideshow or something like that, all client-side stuff with JavaScript. And up at this point, you should be able to either choose to be a freelancer and do stuff on your own, or look for an entry-level position. Now, with the skills that we've talked about so far, you're not going to get anything spectacular, but it could give you an inroad to a really good company where you'll be able to grow and you'll be able to one day be a full-stack developer within that company. So it's completely up to you what you want to do up to this point. Or you may want to just keep learning. Which brings us to what to learn next. So we have a few different options depending on what you want to do. So like I said, this guide is geared more towards full stack developers. So we're going to go ahead and look at things in this order. But if you're planning on being a back-end engineer and creating APIs and not really working with the user interface, then you may want to go right to looking at server-side languages and technologies, such as Node.js, Python, and stuff like that, as well as databases and managing data structures, stuff like that. But again, we're focusing on full stack developers. So the next thing I would suggest to do after learning HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is looking at HTML, CSS frameworks or UI frameworks. So let's take a look at some of these. So Twitter Bootstrap, version 4 is out. That's the most popular framework. It's a general framework, meaning that it's used for all different types of things. It's used for just basic websites. It's also used for applications, things like that. All right. You also have Materialize CSS, which is a pretty new framework. And this is great and geared more towards UI and UX over, website theming. And it has a very sleek look. I actually prefer the look of Materialize over Bootstrap, but Bootstrap is more popular, which makes it a little more beneficial to learn. All right, you also have the Bulma framework, which I think is a great framework. It's easy to learn. It has a really common sense syntax. One difference with Bulma is it's straight CSS components. There's no needed JavaScript, and it doesn't depend on jQuery or anything else like the previous two frameworks do. You also have the Zurb Foundation framework, which was is a direct competitor of Bootstrap. and it has been for a long time, but I think that frameworks like Materialize and Bulma, some of these newer frameworks are much better. Foundation seems to be very heavy to me, and frankly, I think the design, the default look of it is pretty ugly. So I wouldn't suggest Foundation, but who knows, you might like it. And then we also have Skeleton CSS, which is not really a framework. It's more of a boilerplate. It's very, very light. I really like it for prototyping. So for basically applications where you're just building out the functionality, you don't really care what the front end looks like. That's what Skeleton is really great for, in my opinion. I wouldn't necessarily use it on a real application. So front-end JavaScript frameworks. Now, like I said, if you're not going to be doing this, if you're not going to be using React or Angular or anything, then this really isn't that important to you. But if you're going to be a full-stack developer, you're probably going to want to look at start learning a JavaScript framework. So React is a great framework, very popular, especially for startups. It's super fast, it's super light. It uses a state manager called Redux, which is separate from React, but it's often used with it. It uses JSX to render HTML, which is the JavaScript syntax, or no, JavaScript extension, something like that. And it uses that instead of templates, which is a little different than some of the other frameworks. So we also have Angular, which is also very popular, especially in the world of enterprise and business. Angular is much more bloated than React, but it also includes a lot more in the core framework. And by the way, React is technically a library. I know that before you guys start leaving comments, but you can easily add stuff onto it to make it a full framework. So you can add the router, you can add the HTTP client, whatever. Back to Angular, it's very full-featured, has everything included. It even has a state manager called NGRX, which I don't have much experience with, but from what I've read, it's very similar to Redux. So Vue.js is one of my favorite frameworks. I would say it's the easiest to learn, and there's no bull crap surrounding it. It's very very straightforward. The syntax is clear. It also has a state manager called Vuex. And then the last framework I'm going to mention is Aurelia. And it's not as popular as the other three, but I really like it because it's very natural and it's very close to vanilla JavaScript. The way that we write classes seems like you're just writing regular JavaScript. And you have the option to use ESNext, which basically means the latest features of ECMAScript, or TypeScript, which is also it's a superset of JavaScript and also used with Angular. All right, so there's plenty of others I didn't mention. Ember is one of them, which is really great, and it's a really full-featured framework. I think the learning curve is a bit steeper, at least in my opinion, but you'll also want to check out Ember and some of the others in your research. All right, so we've talked about some of the popular front-end technologies. Now, while you're learning that stuff, you should also be learning these things. These are basically side technologies that you should be learning. So one is Git, which is a version control system and is used by just about every software development team on the planet. It can be used with many different services, but GitHub is the most popular. It can be complicated, but just knowing the basics will help you out a lot. And just knowing how to create a GitHub repository and push your code to that repository and pull from it and make updates, this will really up your game as a developer. So it gives you, version control, it gives you backup, it gives you collaboration with other developers. The advantages of using Git are endless, so I would definitely suggest that. And I actually have a crash course on Git if you want to check that out. So at this point, you should be dabbling in the command line. If you're using frameworks like Angular or React, chances are you're using the command line interfaces that come with them to set up your applications. And you should also be using NPM, which is Node Package Manager. And you should know how to navigate between folders, how to create files, things like that. Okay, you don't need to be a pro with the command line, but you should know some of the basic commands. All right, you also want to start to learn about APIs and REST. You want to know what a REST API is, how it works. Even if you're a front-end developer, you need to know how to make HTTP calls to a back-end API, whether you're doing it with the JavaScript fetch API or if you're doing it through a framework like Angular, which has its own HTTP library. This is something that is the future and you definitely want to look into. You also want to look at the different types of requests you can make with HTTP. So get requests, post requests, put, patch, delete, and know what each one of those requests are meant for. Okay, and also do some reading up on SSL and security and HTTPS. Okay, so these are just some of the side technologies that you want to learn. Now, you also may want to learn about CSS preprocessors such as Sass and Less. I would definitely recommend Sass over Less. It seems to be getting much more traction these days. And what a CSS preprocessor does is it allows you to use things like variables and functions or mix-ins inside of your CSS. Okay, and you can do things like logic and just stuff that core CSS does not do. And that's something that you may want to look into as well. Now, if you're a JavaScript developer, you're going to want to learn Webpack and Babel. Webpack is a module loader, so you can use, for instance, NPM modules on the client side. There's also presets to integrate Babel, which is a JavaScript compiler. And Babel is used to take newer features of JavaScript from newer standards like ES6, ES7, and compile them down to older ES5 code, which is the version of JavaScript that runs on all older browsers. And if you plan on being a Python or C# developer, this isn't as important. But if you're going to be a JavaScript developer, then you should definitely learn Webpack and Babel. All right, so now we're on to server-side technologies and server-side languages. Node.js isn't a language, but it is a server-side technology. It's a runtime, and it uses the JavaScript language. So it's basically JavaScript on the server. And this would be my recommendation for most developers. It's popular, it's fast, it's scalable, it's very powerful, it's asynchronous. It's a language you already know because you've already learned some JavaScript, hopefully. It runs on the server instead of a browser environment. That's the biggest difference, but it's the same language. You also get NPM, which is the Node package manager, and you can install endless packages to achieve whatever kind of functionality you want. All right, so my next recommendation would be Python at this point, which is a big change from last year where I would recommend PHP. Python I've worked with a lot more in the past, I'd say 6 or 7 months, and it's just a fantastic language. It's very popular. It's great for rapid development. You can create things very quickly. It has great integration with just about everything. So it's definitely something that I would recommend for your server-side technology. Now, PHP is not the best language. It's not the prettiest language by far, but it is very practical. It's easy to deploy. You can easily deploy it to shared hosting accounts. It's the language of WordPress, which is the most popular content management system. It also uses the Laravel framework, which is very popular. Even people that don't like PHP tend to like Laravel. It's just a very elegant framework. And you also have Ruby, which, Ruby on Rails, which is a great framework, great MVC framework. It provides rapid development. It has a really strong community, but I do think that Ruby has fell off a little bit. And that may just be my opinion, just from the stuff that I've looked at and that I've read. And I said this last year too, I believe. But I think that with Node.js, since Node.js has been introduced, I think that it's kind of stolen some of the glory from Ruby. But I don't know. You can make your own conclusions about that. And then you also have C# and ASP.NET, which is something that I'm just getting into. I actually didn't even mention C# last year, but it is something that is very powerful. It's backed by Microsoft. And I really like the C# language, but again, I don't have much experience in it, so I can't say too much about it. So those are some of the main choices for your back-end server-side programming. Now, you'll also need to learn a database, and you have different types of databases. Now, MongoDB is an incredible NoSQL database, which is schemaless as far as the data layer goes. It's very scalable, it's very quick, and it pairs fantastically with Node.js. So if you choose Node as your server-side technology, I would recommend MongoDB over anything else. All right, next we have MySQL, which is a traditional relational database that uses tables and rows. MySQL is very popular and can be used with virtually any language. It's popular with Python, PHP, Ruby on Rails, and you can even use it with Node.js. Postgres is similar to MySQL, but it's a little more difficult to work with. It's a bit more featureful, and it's also a bit more powerful. Okay, I don't think it's as popular though. Then we have SQL Server, which is Microsoft's implementation of an SQL database. I haven't used this too much, so I can't say too much about it. As you can see, I haven't, although I use Windows to develop on a lot, I don't really use Microsoft technologies when it comes to web development. Next, you have Oracle, which is heavily used in the enterprise world. Again, this is something I don't have much experience with, but it is a relational database. Now, we also have Firebase, which is a real-time cloud database maintained by Google, and it is fantastic. I really like Firebase. Now, I wouldn't recommend just learning Firebase. I would say learn it in addition to one of these other ones. It is a cloud database, so it doesn't run on your local machine. You actually create an account. You can create a database. It also has authentication and storage, and you can even use it as a hosting platform. So Firebase is definitely something that I would suggest looking at, and it pairs really well with frameworks like Angular and React and Vue. All right, so now that we have looked at server-side languages and technologies, databases, now we want to look at server-side frameworks. Okay, just like we have front-end frameworks, we have server-side frameworks. So let's first look at some of the JavaScript ones. So we have Express, which is the most popular by far. We have Happy.js, Adonis, which is a hardcore MVC framework that feels a lot like Laravel. And then we have new frameworks like Loopback and Swagger, which are frameworks that were built for creating REST APIs and backend services for full stack applications. Okay, I do have a course on Node.js, Express, and MongoDB on Udemy where we build and deploy 2 applications. So I'll put the link in the description for that course if you're interested. All right, next, Python has quite a few frameworks, but the 2 top ones are Django and Flask. These are very, very different from each other. Django is a very high-level framework, meaning that it does a lot for you. It does things the Django way, where Flask is very low-level, and you have the freedom to do things however you want. You can put your whole program in one file if you want. Okay, so there's very little convention. Both are very different, but both are great frameworks. And then you have other ones like Web2Py and Pylons, which I've never used, so I can't say too much. All right, so for PHP, Laravel is extremely popular. Like I said, people that tend not to like PHP still like Laravel because it's a very elegant framework. You also have Symfony, which Laravel is actually built off of. CodeIgniter, which is a really easy to use MVC framework. And then Yi2, which I've used very little, but not really to build anything that's worth anything. All right, so Ruby, of course, we have Ruby on Rails, which is a great MVC framework. You also have Sinatra, Nitro, which aren't as popular, but are also pretty powerful. And then, of course, we have C#, which has the .NET framework, ASP.NET MVC, which is a great model view controller framework, and, of course, is backed by Microsoft and very powerful. So now what I want to do is just take a look at some content management systems, because this is part of web development, especially for smaller firms that don't want to create content management systems from the ground up. This gives them a really nice option for their clients. Now, the most popular content management systems are WordPress, Drupal, and Joomla. Although Drupal and Joomla have fell off a little bit, or Joomla has fell off quite a bit from back when I was using it about 7 or 8 years ago. But WordPress is still thriving, and all of these are built in PHP, which again is not the prettiest language, but again it's very practical. Okay, WordPress, you can actually install WordPress on shared hosting accounts with 1 or 2 clicks. So like I said, these are great for clients because they can log in and they can edit their content. If they want to update their about page or something like that, they can do that very easily. And there's also thousands of plugins and add-ons and themes, so you can customize it. You can create your own plugins, which is pretty easy to create a WordPress plugin. It promotes very fast development because you're not building it from the ground up. You're using something that's pre-made. Now, since it's pre-made, it can be kind of limiting. Obviously, if you're going to create something from scratch, you can do it however you want. So you have a lot of freedom. When you use something that's pre-made like WordPress, even though you can create custom plugins, it can still be limiting to you. Okay, so now building apps is great, but there's going to be a time when you're going to have to make them live on the internet. And to do that, you're going to have to learn about DevOps and deployment. Now, by no means do you need to know everything that I mentioned on this page. These are just some of the things that you'll run into as a developer looking to deploy applications. All right, now, like I mentioned, PHP applications are very simple to deploy onto shared hosting accounts, but then you have apps built with Node.js and Python and Ruby. It's a bit more complicated. So you'll need either a dedicated server, which is your own computer, either local or from a hosting company, or a VPS, which is a virtual private server. It's basically a virtualized server, so it's built in a virtual machine, and these are usually much cheaper than dedicated servers. But what I would suggest is cloud hosting, which is much cheaper, using something like DigitalOcean, which is fantastic. DigitalOcean actually has pre-made environments for Python applications and mean stack applications. Then you have services like Heroku and Amazon Web Services that are built for dynamic applications written in languages like Ruby and Python and Node. All right, you might also want to look into cloud storage with services like Amazon S3, especially if you're using a service like Heroku, which doesn't allow local file uploads. You'll need to use some kind of third-party service like S3. Now, by this time, you're going to want to be working with the command line quite a bit, and you're going to want to work with SSH and secure sockets. It's a very secure way to connect to your server and do updates and maintain it, which is a very important part of application deployment and maintenance. So that's something you're going to want to learn about as well. Now, all of this is very overwhelming. Usually if you work with a team, this kind of stuff will probably be handled by someone else, but it doesn't hurt for you to have a basic understanding of how this stuff works. So just know that you don't have to master all of this. And this goes for everything that I've mentioned in this video. You do not have to master everything here. I'm just trying to take you through kind of a map or a guide of some of the things that you're going to run into and some of the choices you're going to have to make as a developer. All right, now mobile applications, this is kind of a side note. It's not really something that you need to learn, but it will be beneficial if you do. And you can build mobile applications now with web development technologies. Okay, you don't need to know Java or Swift to build a native application. You can now use frameworks like React Native, which uses the React framework to build native applications, and it's not a hybrid application. It's an actual native app that you can upload to the App Store and do anything that you can do with an application built on Java or Swift. Okay, you also have NativeScript, which is similar to React Native, except it uses Angular or pure JavaScript to build native applications. And then you have frameworks like Ionic, which build hybrid applications, which are basically web apps inside of a mobile app container. And that container is usually created by technology called PhoneGap or Cordova. All right, so that provides the what's called a web view, so that you can load web apps in a mobile application without having the browser Chrome around it. And then we also have the Xamarin framework, which allows you to create native applications with C#, okay, which I haven't used, but I've heard good things about. So again, mobile applications, not something you have to do. Doesn't mean you're not a real developer if you can't create a mobile app. It's just something that is relevant at this time, so I figured I'd mention it. All right, so if you have gone through even a third of what we've talked about in this video, then you're probably a full stack developer. So if you can create simple to advanced web applications, front and back end, if you can create a secure REST API that can handle requests and you can send back responses and fetch data from a database, if you can deploy and maintain applications, administer databases, and I don't mean being a professional database administrator. I mean just, going in and adding data, removing data, optimizing, things like that. Then you should be able to get a very good job or run your own business. Okay, now that's a choice you need to make. It seems most people want to get a really good job with a company. Myself, I preferred and I took my own business route rather than working for someone else, and I did it with a lot less knowledge than anything that I've said here. And that's probably a subject for a different video. And I know that all of this stuff is very, very overwhelming, but like I said, I started a business just basically building WordPress websites, not really even knowing PHP enough to create a plugin. So you can, and the same goes for working for a company. You need to have confidence in yourself. It's something that I've dealt with and struggled with, and you guys have probably seen my self-doubt video. If you want to check that out, I'll put the link in the description or up top. But just, don't get overwhelmed by all of this stuff. And that's not my intention. I know a lot of you are watching this thinking, how the hell am I going to learn all this stuff? And don't think that. Don't think that. Just take your time and take a look at each thing that we've talked about and just make some decisions on the routes you want to take and the technologies you want to learn. I guess that's the best advice that I can give you. All right, so what are some of the changes from last year? Okay, because we did a very similar video last year. So we have some new technologies, Grid CSS, the Fetch API, Materialize, Native Script. These are all things that are new this year. I'm not saying they weren't around last year, but they weren't popular enough or established enough to put in the video. Now we're getting to a point where we're more focused on full stack applications and creating REST APIs and then having a front-end framework work with that REST API rather than just rendering views on a server. That's becoming more of a trend in web development, I've noticed lately. We're also more focused, and we should be more focused, on vanilla JavaScript in addition to frameworks. We do need frameworks for complicated applications, but there are times when we're using frameworks when we don't need to. So I think it's really important, especially for JavaScript developers, to really learn the ins and outs of vanilla JavaScript. Single page applications, they were popular last year, they're still popular, and they're still gaining popularity. And then one of my personal changes from the last video is choosing Python and C# over PHP. I'm not saying that PHP is dead or dying. I'm just saying that after looking at these other languages, I can see the benefits over PHP, even though PHP is practical from a point of deploying and WordPress and stuff like that. I'm just saying, as a language, in my opinion, Python and C# are better languages overall than PHP. All right, so what now? You're a full stack developer. You know everything that we've talked about now. No, I'm just kidding. Nobody knows everything we've just talked about. But what do? First thing, if you don't have a job, you want to look for a job or start your own job, start your own business, and you want to focus on your career, okay? Whatever technologies that your company uses, you want to focus on. Don't jump from framework to framework or language to language, at least on a hardcore level. It's okay to learn extra frameworks and languages and stacks in your spare time. You know, if your company works with Angular and Node.js on the back end, focus on those technologies. Watch all the videos you can, read books, take courses, and then maybe, you know, a couple hours on the weekend or something, learn Python as a hobby. All right, but focus on your main needs. Okay, you also want to stay up to date with current trends and technologies. For instance, you want to know when Bootstrap 4, when Beta 3 comes out. You want to stay up to date with that stuff. When's the next version of Angular coming out? What's going to be included? What features are going to be deprecated? You want to be paying attention to that stuff. All right, and then just have fun with it. You know, it's for me, I love this stuff. I love learning new stuff, so it's always fun for me. All right, now I know that was a lot. I really hope it was helpful and not just confusing the crap out of you. If you like this video, leave it a like, subscribe, follow me on social media, join the Discord chat. If you have any issues, we have code doctors in Discord that can help you out. So, you know, thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. This was way friggin' longer than I thought, but thanks, and I will see you next time.